Hello, my name is George Harvey, and here is Tom Finnell. And this show is Energy Week with George Harvey and Tom Finnell, which is kind of a...
Cleverly named.
Cleverly named, yes. And I have an energy blog, geoharvey.wordpress.com, and also work for Green Energy Times, writing stories for them. And the result of that is that I'm exposed to a lot of stories about energy. So I'm delivering what I think are the most interesting stories in the last week, and we will chat about them. I'm going to try in the future to have a guest for each show, but we don't have one today, and so Tom and I are going to be each other's guests. So we'll just start in on the 6th of December. Unistar Nuclear Energy, which is a big utility, completely withdrew its application to build a third nuclear reactor at 9 Mile Point, which is on Lake Ontario. They had this plant on hold for quite a long time, because, and they just withdrew it altogether because they couldn't get federal loan guarantees. So, you know, all of the things that people are complaining about with renewable power not going to the nuclear industry is why the nuclear industry is not going ahead. Is that it? I don't know.
Well, right now, I guess the big bugaboo is gas. Gas is what's
big bugaboo is gas, yeah.
But that's a bubble.
Oh, there's no question in my mind that it's a bubble.
No pun intended, it's a bubble. But,
yeah, I have no doubt of it. There are problems with it that are telling, and they have appeared on the marketplace. The value of leases for gas land has fallen 50%. It wasn't the last year, because I read this a couple of months ago, but yeah, it's a bubble.
There was something that you blogged last week, and it was about this phenomenon, and it referred to a well-known aerospace company. I think it was Fairchild.
Might have been.
And I can't remember the headline, but it was a headline on your blog, and it said, if Fairchild Industries is divesting of their holdings in traditional energy, it's game over.
Yeah.
Words to that effect.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think game over was the actual phrase they used.
Yeah, and the same thing has happened in a number. We're going to see this, not with gas, but with coal, certainly. There's a lot that's appeared in the last week in regard to coal and the coal industry being in trouble. Okay, Representative Peter Welch, a Democrat from Vermont, wherever that is, took to the Washington streets on Thursday to push reform of the government biofuel program. Now, this is a difficult issue. I mean, it's a difficult issue. The renewable fuels has pitted farmer against farmer, because the corn farmers are harvesting corn and it's being made into ethanol, and the ethanol is being used to fuel cars, and there was a push to raise the amount of ethanol in the gasoline from 10% to 15%. Various automotive organizations objected to that, because apparently some auto engines can be damaged when
there's too much alcohol.
There's too much alcohol in it, or ethanol, because there's lots of different kinds of alcohol. But and I had a Prius. My problem with the thing is that when we went from 0% to 10% ethanol in the gasoline, which was done because it's renewable and so forth, I found that my gas mileage, which you can track very closely in the Prius automatically, declined by 10%.
They didn't tell you that was going to happen.
But the manual said, don't use anything but regular gasoline. They said, don't use a mix of ethanol. And I don't think it was because of the gas. I think it was because the engine was tuned for a specific type of gas, and
Yeah.
The tuning in a Prius is extremely complicated, and it goes on continuously. It's a computerized thing. Anyway, Congressman Welsh was concerned about the impact on food and energy prices. And the problem with food, and this is why it's farmer against farmer, is that the people who raise cattle and pigs and chickens and I guess other animals are objecting to the fact that they have seen corn that could have gone to their animals being diverted for cars. And of course that increases their costs. So you see areas in which the majority of the farmers are raising corn in favor of the higher content, and the areas where they're raising other things against it. From my point of view, I think it would be nice to raise less corn, period, because corn is extremely damaging to the soil. It's as bad as tobacco and cotton and things like that. I used to live in Illinois and see corn getting grown in the fields there. It's a lush plant, but we can get a lot of energy out of switchgrass, and that is a perennial that doesn't require a lot of fertilizing.
Another winner in this field is hemp.
Yeah, hemp. Who'd have known?
Well, the truth be known, we don't grow hemp today, not because of marijuana. That's a smokescreen.
Okay.
It's because DuPont, Hearst, who owned miles and miles, square miles, acres and acres of forests, didn't want the competition from hemp. So they played up this racism bit, they played up this morality bit, and we've had prohibition of marijuana and hemp for what, 80 years now?
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's basically not about morality at all.
Well, it's going to change, you know.
Well, it is changing as we speak.
The world is changing. I think it was Colorado which made it legal to sell marijuana, legal to raise marijuana.
I think it's decriminalized now.
Yeah. Okay. President Obama has set all U.S. government agencies a 20% renewable energy generation target by 2020. Agencies must draw not less than 10% of their electricity from renewables by 2015, 15% by 2016, 17.5% by 2017, and so on. So this is something which has been played up quite a lot, and actually some of the government agencies are pushing as hard as they possibly can, the Navy and the Army being among them.
Isn't that interesting? Yeah, yeah.
They say that renewable energy will save the lives of soldiers.
Well, I could buy that.
Yeah, they don't have to move fossil fuels around.
Yeah.
So, okay, we're up to December 7th. The news on December 7th was that the Vermont-based municipal utility, which is Burlington Electric Department, has reached an agreement to buy renewable energy from Maine. This is the Hancock Wind Project near Ellsworth, Maine. And it's 54 megawatts that they're planning on buying, which is a fair amount of electricity.
It is. Yeah, I wonder how much Burlington really uses.
Well, I don't know. It depends. A lot depends on what is the area of the utility. I mean, if it is just Burlington, then we're talking about.
And I'm not sure.
I think it's
certainly not much bigger than Burlington, but it is.
Yeah.
It might include some of the other little towns up there.
Well, it's problematical to an extent. I like to see the renewable energy being used, but on the other hand, it does mean that money is being shipped out of state, and that is something which makes it. It's not being shipped out of country, but do you want the money shipped out of state? The U.S. DOE says that if we develop 2% of the land in Vermont, we can provide 135% of our electricity from wind. And I don't think we want to do that for a variety of reasons, but I would advocate developing something like 0.4% of our land, maybe.
Well, I know that Vermont has been surveyed for its wind potential.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really a surprisingly small amount
Yeah.
of Vermont that's
Yeah.
really attractive for wind.
What I read was 2% of the state's land could be developed, but within that 2%, we're talking about 2% of the land actually being used for wind.
2% of 2%.
2% of 2%. And what, you know, you can see this at Searsburg, for example, where the open area is basically for a road. I find it hard to imagine that any of those wind turbines up there have their blades low enough that a full-grown tree would be hit by them.
No,
Those things are way up in the air.
way up.
But they're keeping the area around the base of them open.
Oh, yeah.
So you have an area that's around the base of the wind turbine, which is not very wide, really, left open.
About an acre total.
For
For-
all of the turbines, or for each?
For each turbine,
For each,
yeah.
yeah. So I think about 11 acres. But that piece of property is a good deal bigger than that.
Oh, definitely. Oh,
I
yeah.
mean, you can't have those things too close, so close to houses that people are going to be actually upset by them. So
Well, that part of Searsburg, well, all of Searsburg is sparsely settled.
yeah,
But that
they
part
have
is-
about 100 residents. Yeah. Well, we could develop Lewis. Nobody would mind there. That has a population of 0, or at least so I'm told. Now, on the other hand, Burbank Water and Power in Burbank, California, aims to get 66% of its electrical supply from renewable resources by 2025.
What's their principal source?
Let's see, does it say here? To meet the state goal, they're planning on using an integrated system managing forecasting, generation, voltage, and switching to optimize available resources. I don't know.
So Burbank is what, L.A.?
I don't know where it is. Where is Burbank?
I'm not too familiar with California real estate.
I'm not either. And you know, I think I could go. My inclination would be to go immediately look for it, but because I'm on the internet. But unfortunately, we're under the gun for time, so I think we should just keep going. Okay. On the 8th, the average price of a new car. This is a good one. I like this. The average price of a new car in November 2013, according to Kelly's Blue Book, was $32,769. More than I can afford. In fact, it's probably $32,000 more than I can afford. All right. Given
You're in the club.
Yeah, right. After the federal tax rebate of $7,500, which is what you can get when you go to a plug-in car, almost every plug-in electric car on the market, and I can think of one good exception to this, is cheaper than the average car. Now, when you combine that with the fact that there's virtually no maintenance on these things, I mean, the mufflers are warranted for the life of the vehicle.
I didn't know there was a muffler.
That's why they more ditto for, you know.
Got me that one.
Yeah, I did. I'm very proud of myself. The cost of running these cars is about 3 cents a mile. So, you know, we're talking about a very inexpensive way to get around, and most of them you can drive 80 miles or 100 miles or something like that. And with a Tesla, of course, you're not in the same price range. But
That's a couple of 100 miles, isn't it?
Tesla?
Yeah.
I don't know. I know that one of the expensive things about the Tesla is the lithium-ion batteries.
Well, I do know they had it was a publicity stunt, I suppose, but they drove a Tesla from Washington to New York.
Mm-hmm.
And they had charging stations set up on the turnpikes at the appropriate locations.
Yeah.
So it's possible to do it. And
Yeah.
right now, that's really the only drawback I can think of.
Well, Jason told me that when he first got his car, he had some kind of emergency. I don't remember what it was, but he had to drive to Connecticut and back. And I think he may have had to go to Connecticut and back twice on the same day. He put 400 miles on the car. And it was just a matter of, you know, when he needed to stop for lunch, he stopped at a place that had a charging station.
And he's got a
with a
GPS and it's probably built into the car that tells you where they are.
Yeah, he does. The thing has got a computer that tells you how to get to the nearest charging station. Okay. Chinese state news announced that the country's on-grid solar power capacity will reach 10 gigawatts by the end of this year. 10 gigawatts.
That's a lot.
That's a lot. It's the equivalent of about a little over 3 medium-sized nuclear power plants. People try to make a power plant 1 gigawatt, but solar power doesn't have the capacity factor of nuclear. It's only about a third as much. So you have to figure about 3 gigawatts of solar to 1 gigawatt of nuclear. But even so, that's 3 nuclear power plants, and it is a 200% increase from a year ago.
Okay, so we're moving in the right direction.
They're moving. They're moving. Just how long does it take for a 200% increase per year to take over the energy supply of China? You put on 200% per year, and you're going to have them providing the world with power in 10 years. But they're not going to do that because 200% growth is unsustainable. Nevertheless, that's what they did last year. Now, think of China, think of all the people in China, think of Australia, think of all the people in Australia. I don't know how many of that is, but the two countries are about the same size. And I would guess that China has a population that's about 30 times that of Australia.
Easily.
Yeah. Australia has passed through another significant solar milestone, reaching 3 gigawatts.
Okay.
10 gigawatts in China, 3 gigawatts in Australia, which has probably the one government among developed countries that is the most anti-renewable.
The present government
is. Present federal government. The state governments are not. I mean, Tasmania said that they were going to go to 100% renewable by 2020. All right.
They're off by themselves in an island.
They're on an island, yeah. And that makes it have renewable makes a lot of sense for islands. A lot of islands, including Hawaii, are going to renewable power because the conventional power is so expensive. But they say that Queensland has hit 1 gigawatt by itself. And this is interesting. States like South Australia have reached household penetration rates of 25%.
Wow.
Yeah. This is becoming mainstream. When 25% of the population has got it, it's mainstream.
Yeah,
and the reason they're doing that is because these people are paying a lot of money for power, and they want to switch to lower prices, so they're going to solar. All right, 12/9, the 9th of December. And this is a day that was, oh, here we go. There's only one item on 12/9 I wanted to talk about. Drax, which is it's one of the big power producing companies in Britain. They have a power plant that had 6 units. They were all coal-fired. And they converted 3 of those units in a 700 million pound cleanup project to biomass. So they're burning wood instead of coal in 3 of the 6 units.
Britain.
In Britain, yeah.
Where are they getting the wood?
This is the scary part. It's the part that bothers me. I think they're buying wood pellets from the United States.
Well, there's a big market in Europe. Scandinavia is selling a lot of wood pellets around the world.
Yeah.
They're selling some to the United States.
Yeah, and we're probably selling
and
wood
we're
pellets.
selling some of them. Yeah.
I think what they should do is just leave the ships in the ports. But it is a concern to me because I think we have to move away from coal, but we don't need to destroy our forests in the process.
Well, I know in the British Isles, I'm aware of it in Ireland, they're burning a lot of crop residue. They call it straw, but it's crops.
Crop residue.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
They call it straw, but it's not hay without seeds. It's soybeans and it's tomatoes and it's whatever they grow that they can't eat.
Yep. And that is a big deal. And you know, I mean, really, there should be people who are looking at this to make sure that that's done in a sustainable manner, because all of that represents ash that's being removed from the ground. And that means that the minerals in the ground are being changed. So the ash should be returned to the soil.
Should be,
somehow.
and it can be.
It can be. It's not a big
deal. It will
deal.
be eventually.
Yeah, it will be. But I think, you know, it'd be nice to have a biologist sit there and say, well, here's what we've got in terms of the chemistry of the ash, and here's what the plants need. And so we're going to convert this ash into something that can be spread on the ground. But, you know, that I think is I think it's an important consideration. You've got to be careful not to destroy the soil. And it's one of the reasons why I think switchgrass is superior to soybeans for a thing like this in some respects. I mean, soybeans as legumes are doing something for the soil. But the switchgrass is going to put a lot of carbon into its roots. So when you harvest switchgrass, you're sequestering carbon underground.
It remains in the ground.
Right, which is why you can have a cellulosic system that goes to something like butanol, which winds up being carbon negative.
Yeah, yeah, you said that. It's almost doesn't make sense, but it does.
Yeah, when you look at what's actually happening, it's carbon negative.
Who thinks about the roots?
Who thinks about the roots? Exactly. The amount of wood that's in a tree, though, typically above ground, is approximately equal to the amount that's underground.
Yeah.
And yeah, who thinks about the roots? Anyway.
And it's already buried.
It's already buried. It's already sequestered. It will eventually decompose. But now here on the 10th, we have two items. Actually, we've got two pairs of items that are related. And the first is the price of new power purchase agreements. All right? So this is people going out and buying power under power purchasing agreements, which is, you know, the Burlington Electric buying it from a wind farm in Maine. The price of new purchase power agreements for wind farms and solar projects in the United States continues to defy all expectations, making some energy experts wonder why anybody would contemplate a new fossil-fueled plant.
Of any sort.
Of any sort, and that includes gas.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the next one is renewable energy and aging grid and the solution that matters. This is an opinion piece that appeared on the 10th. The grid is old. And not just the grid is old, but also all of the, you know, much of our electric generating capacity is old. And it has to be replaced.
The grid, as the grid, was never planned as a unit. It grew like Topsy.
Yeah, it did. Absolutely
and
true.
You know, what suited this particular utility didn't necessarily suit their adjoining utility.
Well, you know, a really good example of that is Japan, where half of the country is on 60 cycle and half of the country is on 50.
I didn't know that. Wow. Could be pretty
and we've
confusing.
We've got a big grid organization in Texas, which is not tied to the national grid because it's not synchronized.
Yeah.
So that's what they've got. But what this says is it's old. With or without renewables, it has to be replaced. And interestingly enough, this business about grid stability and renewables, if you look at what's actually happening in the marketplace, you realize that distributed power puts less stress on the grid than centralized power.
Well, that does make sense. I mean, if you're feeding into the grid at many different locations,
yeah,
it's more balanced just to begin with.
Yeah.
Instead of having one big thing over here and another big thing over there, and then miles and miles of transmission line in between them.
High tension lines. These things are big. These are big lines. They carry a lot of electricity.
Yeah.
The voltages are very, very high, and you know that is specialized equipment. Where if you're transmitting from a power resource in one town to another, the next town over, the transmission lines that are needed for that are very small. They're
Absolutely
inexpensive, right. And they're easy to fix by comparison. So,
well, they are basically what you see on the high end of the local telephone poles, local power poles.
Right, right.
They're not these huge transmission lines
Yeah.
that cut across the country.
Yeah. I think we're going to see some new grid designs come up.
Well, it's inevitable. I mean,
Yeah.
it's not going to be done by for any other reason than it makes economic sense.
Well, yes, that's true. Well, no, I disagree with you on that. I think that the economic sense, yes, I think we could say that security makes economic sense.
Yeah, there's a security aspect of it because the big ones are quite vulnerable.
They're vulnerable, and I'm not talking about security in relationship to terrorists or something like that. You know, Hurricane Irene should have taught us a lesson, and we have to be secure about that. That kind of grid disaster where large parts of large areas are without power for periods of days, and in fact, the predictions about the grid are that under certain circumstances, which are just nature doing doing its thing that nature does every once in a while, we could have the national grid down for years.
This is within the realm of possibility.
It's within the realm of possibility. People don't realize
it's kind of scary.
It is very scary. There was a solar storm in the 1850s. I think it was 1855. That was so powerful that transmissions that telegraph transmissions started to happen and be sent spontaneously, and telegraph keys that were disconnected from their power sources
We're sparking.
They were sparking, but they were also clicking, and the telegraph lines were bringing electricity into the offices in sufficient power that it was causing fires. And the calculation that I have seen is that most of the transformers in the United States would be burned out by such a storm.
The real tall, big, high voltage transformers.
Which are not manufactured
and there's no one in America
States,
makes them.
Which
and
means,
nobody puts them on a shelf either.
That's right. Which means that we would have almost nothing in the way of transformers until we could get them, either by building a factory in the United States and making them, or by bringing them in from abroad. But a solar storm is a global event. Yeah. So this is something that can happen. It has happened in the past. I've talked to people in the nuclear industry about it, and they say, "Oh, don't worry about it. We'll have diesel oil for our backup generators, no problem." And I'm sitting there thinking to myself, these diesel trucks that they're talking about bringing, do they have no computers? Because it'll fry a computer.
Yeah.
There are ways of avoiding it. You can use a thing called a Faraday cage.
Yep.
You know what a Faraday cage is.
I know what Faraday cage. Built one once.
Did you?
Yeah.
I know vaguely what a Faraday cage is.
Well, basically, in this particular case, it was a room, about maybe a quarter the size of this room, with copper screening around it in 2 layers.
Okay.
And we used it for testing cables.
Okay.
And the idea was to isolate the test equipment from what was going on in the plant.
Yeah.
Because we'd be testing a cable and some machine would go on and we get a big blip, and
Yeah.
so we decided if we're going into the high voltage cable business, we had to isolate our
My experience
our
with them
equipment.
had to do with computers. And in the early 1980s, when I was just starting out as a computer engineer, there was a machine called a Tempest machine, which was a portable machine that had a Faraday cage built into the containment. And somebody got very upset about this and wrote a letter, I think it might have been to Byte magazine or something, and said they thought this was probably because it would resist the ion burst of a nuclear bomb, because these things were being specified for places like the Pentagon. And whoever was answering this said no. They thought that was not the reason why that was happening. The reason was because they wanted to secure the data. And what happens is, with a little computer like these things, when you type, every keystroke produces some sort of thing which is transmitted like a radio signal. And you can actually read what a person is typing from 100 yards away if you've got the appropriate equipment.
People do it.
There are
Keystroke.
a very few people who do it, and my guess is that it's extremely boring.
When I say people, I don't necessarily mean individuals.
Yeah, well,
People like the NSA.
yeah.
They're people.
I don't know what they're going to do with keystrokes, though.
Corporations are people too, my friend.
Right, yeah, I should have thought that. Well, the U.S. Patent Office doesn't seem to think so, which is why a company cannot apply for a patent, because a company has no ability to invent anything.
That's true. I just never thought of that.
Yeah,
but yeah, that's an interesting development.
Patent Office will not do that. Anyway, if you're transferring data, if you're taking something from your hard drive and putting it on a different drive or thumb drive or something like that, that all gets signaled out too. Mm-hmm. And so it's possible, if you have, for example, computerized voting machines, a person who set up a station opposite the voting place on the other side of the street could read what is being done inside the voting station and know what the count is when the last vote goes in before the count is. Again, we're talking about a situation that is, I think, questionable on a number of levels, economics being not the least of them. But well, we're digressing, I'm afraid, badly here. It's fun, but we're doing it. The grid is old, with or without renewables. It's going to have to be replaced.
Oh, definitely.
And in fact, at Green Energy Times, one of the things we're going to do, not in the next issue is coming out on the 15th of December, but in the February issue, we're going to have an article in which we're talking about redesigning the grid for reliability and resilience.
Well, it makes good sense. And one thing you haven't mentioned is the grid hasn't been properly maintained. It's an expense.
A lot of things have not been maintained.
And not a high, what would you say, priority for the utilities. Mm-hmm. They fix it when it's broken, but they don't make improvements. And they've been doing it for a long, long time just because of the emphasis on the bottom line.
This is an interesting point, Tom. We hear a lot about efficiency of scale, right?
Yeah.
And a big power plant, if you're burning coal, for example, nuclear is a better one, actually. A big power plant is going to give you efficiencies of scale that make certain sizes.
By that, yep.
Yeah. The grid, however, and this is not true just of the grid, it's also true of corporate structures and things of that nature. As you build up the grid and you have to get distribution systems that go hundreds of miles, those distribution systems get bigger and bigger and more expensive. And they take more and more of the total load. But the local kind of grid of a town or a neighborhood or something like that, in a system where you've got distributed power, that really doesn't get changed. The thing that gets changed is that very big, very expensive part. And I think it was $7 billion to get power from the Panhandle of Texas to Austin. They put in a $7 billion grid extension. And the reason was just to get wind power from Panhandle to Austin. It's expensive. It is really expensive. Okay, continuing with the news, which is why we're here. The Union of Concerned Scientists released new findings on the viability of U.S. coal generators. And I will tell you, we got a bunch of news on the same day, the 10th, on coal, and all of it looked really bad for the coal industry. I'm sorry, I'm laughing. People are going to be, losing investments and stuff like that, and I'm laughing. It's funny. Oh boy. When I get to the pearly gates, they're going to ask me about this one. Showing that 59% gigawatts of coal capacity are not cost competitive when compared to natural gas. 59 gigawatts of coal are not competitive compared to natural gas. And more than 71 gigawatts are uneconomic when compared to wind. Now, there's a third part of this little thing, which is the comparison of natural gas to wind.
Okay.
59 gigawatts of coal are not competitive with natural gas, and 71 are not competitive with wind. And I would presume that the 59 gigawatts that are not competitive with natural gas are also not competitive with wind. But what that would tell me is that there's a bunch of places out there where wind power is a whole lot cheaper than natural gas, even at the low prices for natural gas that we currently have.
I think you're absolutely right. For one thing, we're not paying anything for the fuel.
Yeah.
And until people have figured out how to charge you for wind, and they're probably working on that.
They're working on it. You can bet. You can bet. Well, you know, there was a thing. I think Alec came up with a thing where they want to tax people who have PVs on their roofs because they're free riders.
May I touch my uvula?
With coal plants, this is the other thing that came out the same day. With coal plant retirement news from Maryland and Pennsylvania last week, 1/3 of all coal-fired power plants in the United States are now scheduled for retirement.
A third?
A third of them.
Just on the basis of economics?
Just on the basis of economics. Bringing up the total up to 158 out of 523 coal-fired power plants. And that is, again, and that's not the only bad news for the coal industry. We've seen this in this last week. On the 11th, this is yesterday, Duke Energy will have the Crystal River nuclear plant, quote, placed in safe, stable condition for 60 years until decommissioning work is completed in 2074. End quote.
Yeah.
I would like to own the crystal ball that came up with this, because I'd love to be able to look that accurately into the future.
2074 is a long time away.
Yeah, it is. And you know, one of the things that I come up with when they're talking about this kind of thing, in 1914, the German mark was basically a quarter. It was a 25-cent piece. Mm-hmm. The mark and the quarter had approximately the same amount of silver in them, pretty close. And you could buy a postage stamp in Germany for an amount of money which was a portion of a mark. Might have been a quarter of a mark. Mm-hmm. Might have been less. In the United States at that time it was 3 cents. Mm-hmm. So you would have got 8 postage stamps if you used a mark to buy 8 first-class postage stamps for letters if you used a mark to buy postage in the United States. Inflation during and after the First World War was so bad that by 1922, the German government was selling postage stamps denominated in hundreds of millions of marks.
Hundreds
of millions.
This is kind of well known. This is kind of famous, isn't it? The Weimar Republic.
Yeah.
And
the thing that was amazing about this, you know, you hear things like, that can't be done. That can't be done. It'll never happen. How do you stop inflation? Well, that republic, Weimar, by the way, W is pronounced like a V.
Yeah.
I hate to correct you, but everybody, you should notice that we're allowed to correct each other. So if you hear something that is not coming through and it's not corrected, you know it's true, or at least both of us agree on it. That was the idea on how to stop that was done by the Weimar Republic. They just said, we're going to stop inflation, and they did it.
What was
the
mechanism?
It was a mechanism that basically said, you're going to turn in all the money. Anything you don't turn in is going to have no value at all. Mm-hmm. We're going to convert it to a new mark, mm-hmm. and the new mark is going to be guaranteed mm-hmm. in silver. Mm-hmm. I don't know how they guaranteed it. I don't remember, but it might have been silver. There have been various schemes on guaranteeing money in the United States, too, besides using metal. And the money that we've got now is not really guaranteed by anything. It used to be silver. It used to be gold. During the Civil War, they guaranteed some of the money in postage stamps that could be used to mail letters.
Did they really?
It was called
I don't remember hearing that
money.
one. Yeah.
But again, we're digressing. It's fun, but that's what we're doing. What I'm saying is, yeah, they're going to have money in 60 years. Good luck. Maybe they will. Maybe they won't. In the meantime, I hope they take their fuel out of their spent fuel pool and put it into dry casks, so if anything goes wrong, at least the local people don't have to pay for it.
Yeah, I hear you. I wish
mean,
we'd do the same thing right here.
We've got to get that fuel out of Vermont Yankees spent fuel pool. I mean, it's not good there. And you know, at Fukushima, the fuel that was in the dry cask storage was undamaged. The stuff in the spent fuel pool was in trouble, and we have more fuel in the Vermont Yankee spent fuel pool than they had in all of the reactor spent fuel pools at Fukushima.
And that's 7 stories in the air.
Yeah. Safest place around.
Something doesn't make sense here.
No, this is, there's a lot that doesn't make sense. Okay, moving on. Over the next 2 decades, natural gas and renewable energy, particularly wind and solar, will provide all new power generating capacity for the primary electric grid in Texas, according to a study that was done by a presumably competent organization. This is natural gas, wind, solar, possibly other renewables. And again, you know, I don't think I think the natural gas bubble is a bubble.
Yeah,
I really do.
I'm with you there.
And you know, they had that earthquake in Texas. It was 3.7. People were upset about this. That happened, they're certain, because of fracking.
Fracking, yeah.
So, now here's more bad news for coal. This is also yesterday. The European Bank for Reconstruction and Development has announced that it will be introducing a new strategy to help countries switch from coal as a source of energy to cleaner renewable technologies. The European Bank for Reconstruction and Development is not loaning money for coal. And that, again, is just another, and it happens that at the same time, we were getting other news that I don't have on this list, but, you know, might as well be mentioned. The Navajo have a big coal-burning plant. And the question is, what do they do about this? Because it's destructive to the Navajo territory. It's polluting. And they were wondering what should they do about having this plant. It employs a lot of people. They don't have a lot of money.
It employs them.
It employs them.
So the whole thing is within their territory.
Yeah, it employs them. They have coal mines, I think. And this is a big deal for the Navajo Nation. And somebody did a study for them, and the study said, okay, if you close down a third of that facility and you close down the mining that supports it, you're going to lose a certain number of jobs. If you replace that facility with new renewable facility, you're going to make up that number of jobs. So the cost to the Navajo Nation of closing this down in terms of employment and so forth is trivial in those respects. And it also means that they have an improvement in their environment, and they're probably going to be paying lower power bills in due course.
Kind of makes sense.
I mean, if you think about it, the payoff period for solar and wind is usually 7 years or something like that. Once that payoff period happens, if you own it, you're getting free power. Okay. Today's news, and here again we've got a couple of items that really kind of go together, and these first 2 items I think are really interesting. This came from India. So far, 10,752 Indian villages. Now I want to point out, this is news I found today. It came from yesterday. That being the case, this number has probably increased because they're moving fast. So far, 10,752 Indian villages have been electrified using various renewable energy systems. These are people, 10,752 villages where they did not have power, have got power because of renewable energy systems being brought in. Why can they do that? Because there is no grid in these villages. Yeah. So they're just establishing a local mini-grid or microgrid for, in many cases, the purpose of turning on a light bulb, turning on a fan, turning on a cell phone charger, and that's what a house has. That's what the electricity is, and they can do the son can read, do his homework by electric power instead of kerosene, and we have a fan. I read that in an article. I thought it was amazing to me. And when they had these big grid outages in India, the people in these little villages, 10,752 of them, well, it wasn't that number by then, but had power. And the people in the big cities who were on the 29th floor of an apartment building at 87 degrees, with the air conditioning off and the refrigerator off and the elevator not working, no television, no lights. We're looking out at night at little teeny farming villages that had not had power in the past, and seeing them lit up at night.
Interesting.
Isn't it? Over 29 gigawatts of renewable energy has been installed in India. Now, this does not include large hydro. It does include almost 20 gigawatts of wind power. By the way, there was a really interesting thing about wind power. We talked about it last week, where the efficiency rates of wind turbines are going up. And the result of that, we did talk about it last week. I don't think this was mentioned. The capacity factor of some wind turbines and these are onshore turbines in Texas, have actually reached 50%.
I'm not sure I know what you're saying.
Okay. A nuclear plant usually spends a month out of 18 down for refueling. And then there are other times that it's going to be off for maintenance and so forth.
I'm starting to get it.
Yeah. So it's running at full capacity during the other times. And so typically nuclear in the United States runs at about 90% capacity factor. In other countries, it's usually closer to 80%, which worries me a little bit, because I think that the Americans might be trying to be running sprints here when they should be walking. But nevertheless, other types of power have their capacity factors. Coal plants are off more than nuclear plants. And so their capacity factor is down around 80% or possibly a little bit lower. Natural gas plants are even lower yet.
Are they really?
I'm not sure why. And that, you have to divide natural gas plants into the traditional natural gas plant and what's called peaking.
Yeah.
And the traditional natural gas plant
baseline,
is an inexpensive plant to build and operate. A peaking plant is not. Peaking plants natural gas plants are very expensive, and the power they produce is very expensive. But and this is something that people are talking about doing so that they can provide power when the grid is, in theory, unstable from renewables. Although I would say that there's better ways of doing it that makes the grid more stable with renewables than it is with coal and nuclear. Nevertheless, the capacity factor for solar and wind varies. In New England, the solar capacity factor is obviously lower than it is in California, although we do have some advantages in New England that the people didn't know about 20 years ago. They were just measuring sunshine. What they didn't realize is that when a PV heats up, it reduces the efficiency. This does not happen in Vermont, but it does happen in California, where the temperatures get hot. So the capacity factor in California is not all that much higher than it is in Vermont, but the capacity factor for the capacity factor for solar is getting better because the panels.
So this capacity factor has to do with the intermittency or the lack thereof.
Well, it's the percentage of the power that you theoretically could get based on the nameplate power capacity versus the actual delivered amount.
So what you're telling me is that in Texas, these wind power plants are producing half the time.
Yeah, that's right. Well, they're producing all the time, really, almost, but they're producing
significant amounts
yeah,
half the time.
Yeah, or they're producing half the amount of power that you would expect them to if they were producing at 100% all the time, which they can't do. But at 50% power, this means that they are producing power in light winds. And they are producing power nearly all the time. And this is a significant piece of news that you know. Anyway, to get back to the news items, we were talking about Indian villages, and the Indians have got this new wind power, 20 gigawatts of wind power, 4 gigawatts each of small hydro and bioenergy, and 2 gigawatts of solar. It's interesting to me that solar is at such a small level.
In India.
In India, but
they have a lot of sun in India.
They have a lot of sun, and they're installing solar, but they're installing solar in dribs and drabs here and there in order to provide power for these 10,000 plus villages. And the wind power tends to be installed by utilities in India and elsewhere too. Now, let's pair that item with this next item. According to I think it was the World Health Organization, this came from the Federal Ministry of Environment in Nigeria. No fewer than 98,000 Nigerian women are killed every year by smoke from wood cooking fires.
Well, that's something you don't even think of at all.
I shouldn't have said that. Oh, yes, it does say firewood. Yeah, you don't think of that. You don't think of that. This is renewable power. A wood stove cooking is renewable power. And I would think that some of these people are not actually killed by smoke inhalation so much as a lot of them are very likely killed by carbon monoxide, which is the same sort of thing, but it creeps up on you a whole lot faster. And this has been a problem anywhere people were cooking indoors with fires through history.
Well, I guess in these more primitive conditions, they don't even have chimneys.
They don't have chimneys. That's right. They have a
got a fire in the house.
A fire in the house. And in fact, excuse me, I saw a picture. I have it somewhere, but I found it online, of the interior of a Longhouse in Germany, and the picture was produced around 1900. I think this was a photograph of the inside of a Longhouse. Now, the German Longhouse, which was something that was typical of northern Germany, near the borders of Denmark and the Netherlands and Belgium, but it also existed in other parts of Europe. The German Longhouse was, in fact, rather similar to the longhouses used by the Indians in the United States.
That's what I was thinking, yeah.
Colonial times. And the German longhouse had a long set of stables and things like that where the animals could be at night, with a big open area. And then where the stables end, the open area is the full size of the building. And in the middle of that open area is the fire. And then past the open area, on the other side of it, was an area which was walled off, and that's where people slept. Which means that the people had no heat to their sleeping quarters at all, really. And they had basically what were boxes to sleep in. They were kind of like closets turned sideways. And you'd climb into one of these things, lie down on the cushion, pull a blanket over you, and close the door. And I think they were probably toasty inside those things. But there was one fire. There was no chimney. The fire just went up to the roof. And, you know, the strategy in a lot of the European houses was that the smoke would go through the thatch. It would just go right through, and the whole thatch. In other places, they had a thing called a louver, which was like a cupola on the roof with louvered windows. And the louver allowed the smoke to go out. In other places, there were big permanently open windows on the ends of the eaves, and the smoke went out through them. But in the early Middle Ages, the people in Europe had open fires in their houses, and the houses were very well ventilated, meaning that the wind could blow right through them. Now, the chimney, this was not, by the way, any worse than it was in Roman times, or Greek times, classical times. The chimney was a medieval invention. And the idea of having a fireplace in a room that could heat that one small room was a medieval thing that was brought about that made it possible for people to sleep in their own heated rooms. The Great Hall was where everybody slept in the castle. I mean, everybody in the castle slept in the Great Hall, all of them. And they also had their eating facilities there, and so forth. They had independent cooking. It was outdoors. The peasants in towns very often had no fire in their house, which was a one-room cottage with a dirt floor, typically. The cooking was done outdoors over an open fire. The monasteries and the castles had kitchens that had huge open windows. You know, I remember visiting. There are very few of these left, but I remember visiting one when I was in England. And yes, there are ways of improving this situation. There's the rocket stove, which is a little stove, for people who don't know. It's about this big around, about that tall. And it has a little teeny firebox, and you put wood in there, more or less, you know, regularly. It might be 5-minute intervals. They're just tiny sticks.
You put sticks in it, yeah.
And you have a highly insulated chimney, so you get a very hot fire. There's no regulation on the air going to the fire, but one of the results from this is that there's no combustible particulates, and there's no carbon monoxide. The only thing that you get left out of this is carbon dioxide and ash.
Well, you're getting a very hot fire.
Very hot.
And the air rushes right through it.
That's right.
Which is why you get a very hot fire.
And the
it's like
heat
a
of
forced draft.
That's right. It's a very powerful forced draft. And the heat is delivered to the top of this thing.
Yeah.
So when you put a pot at the top, it's almost like putting the pot right in the fire.
Yeah.
But it reduces the amount of pollution, and it reduces the amount of fuel that's used. So they're using these things very widely in poor areas of the world, and in areas where they have big concentrations of people, like refugee camps.
Well, I just saw something on this. I really didn't even know what a rocket stove was about a month ago.
And they were invented only 30 years ago.
And this was on YouTube.
Yes.
And it showed how to make a rocket stove out of cinder blocks.
Yes.
And you needed about 5 cinder blocks. And
Yeah.
It took you all of about 3 minutes to put it together. And in this 3-minute video, the guy's boiling a cup of water or a teapot full of water.
In no time. Yeah. Yeah, it's amazing. There have been a number of developments that are very low tech and very, very powerful. My brother invented one of these things. He invented a filter that could be made by any village potter and sold for $3. And he was living in Bangladesh when he did this. And the government of Bangladesh took water from the Ganges River. And we're talking about one of the most polluted rivers in the world. It may be sacred, but it's polluted. They put water from the Ganges River through the filter and then tested it for bacteria content. They couldn't find any at all.
Amazing.
Yeah. So, and the reason was because what bacteria went through came out the other end dead. And the reason it came through dead was because of silver. So I've got a brother who's got a couple of patents on this, and they are probably, well, they're more worthless than anything I own. I don't own anything with value, because any village potter can infringe on the patent. And then finally, we have an environmental group called Greenpeace. This is the last news item, which is urging the Filipinos to make the world's fossil fuel companies answerable in court for the damage they're doing in the climate. And they want to take the fossil fuel companies to court and make them pay for that typhoon.
Well, it gives us something to think about.
It does. And we are at the end of our time, so thank you very much, Tom.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. This is Energy Week with George Harvey and Tom Finnell. And we suggest that you go to my blog at geoharvey.wordpress.com. I also write for Green Energy Times, and Tom Finnell will let you buy him a beer whenever you'd like. Okay.
Well, I guess we're still on. Where do you find this Energy Times?
Green Energy Times?
Yeah, where do you find it?
It's distributed for free. The Brattleboro Co-op usually has a few copies. It's every other month on the 15th or thereabouts, because in this month it's going to be probably no earlier than the 18th. Nancy Mallory, who is the editor, had to go to California for 2 weeks during the time that it was being put together, because her daughter-in-law was having a baby and she wanted to be there at the time. So she, went out there, and she's frantically working on the final bits of getting this month's thing together. But it's put out in Vermont, New Hampshire, and parts of Massachusetts, Maine, and western Massachusetts, a little bit of Maine, a little bit of New York.
So you might see it in places like the Outlet Center up in South Wardsboro, South Brattleboro.
Possibly, yeah. I don't know if
they got a whole rack full of
yeah. There
like
are about a half a dozen places in the Brattleboro area that have it, but you find it in Burlington.
Well, what you got to do is look for it.
Yeah.
You'll find it.
The solar store in Greenfield has it. Yeah, it's in a bunch of places. And it's very highly thought of. It's kind of surprising because it's a free paper, but the people who read it include, Johanna Miller, who is the head of the organization that put together the VCAN conference, which is part of another organization, and then the letters escape me, grabbed a stack of them, the old one, at the VCAN conference, to take to Montpelier, just to make sure that some of them got given to state legislators.
Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah, and it's interesting to work for that, because there's some, and the VCAN conference was amazing. The people up there were so bright, I was just blown away by, and so many people, aside from seeing people like Bernie Sanders and so forth, but David Blittersdorf was there, standing in line with the rest of us. He is a very bright guy who has real insights, I think. And but and there are a number of people there who are going to be on this show at some point or other. People who produce equipment for micro hydro, and people who produce equipment for other sources of power. There's a beautiful piece of, there's a place called Convergent Automotive, and Convergent Automotive makes boxes that you can put into a Prius to turn the car into a generator for supporting a house.
Now, you mean like in an emergency, or
yeah,
in
an emergency. But the interesting thing is, the Prius, sitting there idling, supporting the house, will use less gas to provide the power than a purpose-made generator does by about half. This is the world is full of very bright people who do very bright things.
Yeah. And we're going to be seeing more of that.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just.
Oh yeah. Yeah. One of the things that came up in the news was this thing where they were saying Sunshot, the Sunshot initiative, they're trying to get the price of solar power down to $1 a watt installed. Mm-hmm. Okay? And that's low. Yeah. And I was sitting there when reading that, and I thought to myself, they want to get the price of solar down to $1 a watt installed by 2020. And they hope to get 15%, 1.5, of the U.S. power supply supplied coming from solar by 2030. And I sat there and I thought, is it possible to go to $1 a watt installed? And then I realized, yes, it is. You have to change regulations, you have to change a few other things, but the really big thing you have to change is the package. And the way you do this is by saying, okay, we're going to pre-install solar panels on metal roofing. Mm-hmm. You know, and what does that do to the price of metal roofing? It jacks it up, but not much.
Not by much.
And
you can print it right on there.
You can print it right on there. And when you do that, I think you could get it down well below $1 a watt installed. And if they do that, do you think it's going to be 15% of the U.S. power supply by 2030?
I think it's going to be.
I don't think so. I think it's going to be more like 50%. They've got to replace all this stuff anyway.
Well,
the hand is writing on the wall, and people are noticing it.
Well, if more than half of the cost of installing solar right now is in the superstructure,
yeah,
it's not the solar panels.
That's right.
And if you're printing it on a roofing material and laying it on your roof, a lot of that stuff's not necessary.
Yeah, and in standing seam metal roofing, you can run an electric line right down the seam at the factory. Yeah. And have a connection at the bottom. Yeah. So the big connecting problem here is just connecting these things one to another.
One to another. Just
and then put it into the power system using some, you know, you're going to have inverters. You're going to have other things of that nature.
But these are all electronic. And they're getting cheap.
Yeah.
20 years ago, that was a big problem.
Yeah.
Not anymore.
Not anymore. And as it goes, it's you know, I'm thinking, people ask me sometimes, do I think that we're going to hit 90% renewable in Vermont by 2050?
I think it's quite possible.
And I say, no. I think we're going to hit 100% renewable by 2035.
Well, you're on the optimistic side, but Lord love you.
Okay.